talking about the games in terms of their story and in terms of their gameplay and also in terms of their impact on gaming at large. And at the end, I'm going to tell you how to install Cataclysm on Windows 8. That sounds like a good deal to you. Let's get started.
There's a balance that every science fiction story has to strike between its technology and its emotional storytelling. Each author will value these things differently. Truly talented authors bridge between the two constantly, underlining technical complexities with characters who shoulder the consequences of that complexity, or broadening the depth of relationships between characters with imaginative complications in the world building. Homeworld, on paper, sounds as if it would be a straightforward, hard sci-fi tale of fleets and the destiny of worlds, on the technical side of the equation. As a game, it would have a particular emphasis on the technical and structural elements of the story, and 3D fleet-to-fleet combat on a truly enormous tactical scale hadn't been attempted yet when the game came out in 1999. It would have been a good sci-fi title, innovative, well-positioned in gaming history to stand out. But people don't see Homeworld that simply. It's widely considered to be one of the greatest strategy titles ever made, and one of the most lasting contributions of gaming to the broader legacy of science fiction in general. The leap from experimental RTS to beloved classic is wholly on account of the game's storytelling and the way the game lets the player experience the scope of the story on a deeply personal level, even within the mechanics. The story is genuinely fantastic itself, easily worthy of being a novel. When the game shipped, it even came with a novella of sorts to back it up. The Homeworld Manual is notable for being this thick, beautifully designed volume that contains a 40-plus page history of Karak, the desert planet where the game opens. It tells the tribe slowly radiating out into the habitable zones of the planet, developing an intricate tribal culture with individual tribes called kiths, and how an ancient discovery would unite them all. The Guidestone, buried in a starship older than all the tribes, contains a star map whose destination is common in every kith's language. Higara, home. No tribe is native to Karak. So over 80 years and countless lives and resources are poured into building the mothership. And this is where the game opens, the triumphant conclusion of an entire planet's decades-long hopes and efforts. It is a new era of possibility, backed by a choral arrangement of Adagio for strings. You're watching footage right now of the remastered version of Homeworld, and we'll talk about the remastering process a little later. For now, it's very important to note that back in '99, this was one of the classiest openings ever put in a game. The remastered version of Homeworld changes no dialogue or cutscenes, besides updating the textures and overall sharpness of the graphical assets. What you see is what people in '99 saw in terms of content. It was jaw-dropping then. Science fiction has always been a cornerstone of game design since the very beginning, but this was something new and bold and entirely beautiful. I remember buying the game when it first came out, one of the most expensive purchases of my middle school life at that point. I couldn't believe they wanted you to have a separate 8-megabyte graphics card for it. Did they think I was made of money? Was it worth upgrading an entire computer to play this game? It was. This game has been lodged in my imagination for 16 years, and I'm hardly alone in that. Homeworld's hook is so good because they start you off with the optimistic flavor of Golden Age sci-fi in the very first level, preparing for a galaxy of adventure. All you need to do is test the hyperdrive and meet the Carsalem, a support vessel which had traveled for years to the edge of the system on conventional drives to meet you. It isn't responding to hails, so you send a probe to investigate. It's a nice, slow build-up, full of tension and a bleeding out of the first level's optimism. Then this. This is just the first of many moments of loss and regret that occur throughout the campaign. The second mission has a perfect rhythm to it. After the tense opener, you have to weather an assault from the mysterious strike craft, and the dogfights are visually spectacular. When we talk about the next game, Cataclysm, you'll have a chance to see the original game engine in action, but whichever game engine you have the game running on, the exhaust trails of fightercraft as they dip, weave, fight, and die is mesmerizing. Genuinely. A good sci-fi author can describe a great battle, a good sci-fi show can show you a great battle. Only a game can generate one on demand from scratch. Only Homeworld does it in such an understated and aesthetically intricate way. There's a sense of momentum and agency to all the units, from the largest to the smallest. They all behave in ways that look gorgeously realistic, if not on account of the graphics, then on account of their rhythms and movements. It's ballistic ballet in space. A hell of a hook. That's the thing about combat in Homeworld. Every tactical situation has a story-driven context and deeply immersive elements, but it is visually thrilling and complex, even and perhaps especially when the stakes are highest and the situation is desperate. When the mothership returns to Karak is on fire. The entire planet, everyone who ever helped build the mothership and dreamt of what Hogara might look like, is dead. All that's left is 6 trays of 100,000 colonists, under fire from warships of unknown design. When you capture one of the warships, the truth comes out. You are all indeed from Hogara. You were exiled thousands of years ago and forbidden from using hyperspace technology that was reverse-engineered into the mothership. When you jumped to the edge of the system, this fleet committed the genocide of your people to enforce this ancient treaty. The Taidan, as they're called, sit comfortably with Hogara as the seat of their vast and corrupt empire. There's no going back for the people from Karak. Karak is a husk. The only choice the exiles have now is to move deeper and deeper into a galaxy that is as novel as it is hostile. At its heart, Homeworld is a very traditional underdog story, but the beats that the story hits, the richness and understated beauty of its presentation, that's all very unique. It's easy to say, a story about a fleet of dwindling survivors backed by a vaguely Middle Eastern-influenced soundtrack? That's not original. I've watched Battlestar Galactica. Well, the reboot of BSG debuted in 2003. This was a finished product in 1999. I have no idea if Homeworld had any influence whatsoever on the new Galactica, but if it did, that's the way the influence would flow, not vice versa. This setup allows some unique and bold game design choices to play out, the most significant and well-considered of which is the persistent fleet. Since the mothership and its fleet represents the totality of your civilization, you don't bounce around between locales and conflicts like other RTS games. Any ships you build or capture will carry from one level into the next, along with any resources you collect. Anything you lose or spend carries over. Your journey from mission to mission is essentially continuous. Only the hyperspace jumps break it up and give the game a chance to let its black and white, hand-drawn cutscenes play out. These cutscenes set up the mission to come and expand on events outside the immediate concerns of Fleet Command. It really enhances the elements of prophecy and destiny as well. These moments of storytelling take on a mythic quality in the black and white. They're treated with immediacy and concern the events of the plot sequentially, but the cutscenes have the flavor of an illustrated retelling, many years after the events themselves. The whole arc of the game moves towards epic and mythical dimensions with a fantastic patience. Only slowly does the journey of the exiles from Karak take shape, even slower before it becomes practically possible to complete the journey. In the process, a lot of amazing science fiction will transpire. You'll meet the Bentusi, a mysterious and fascinating race who welcome you back to the spacefaring world because of Fleet Command. Karen Sajet, one of the mothership's lead designers. She was incorporated into the systems of the mothership themselves as their living brain, what the Bentusi call unbound. They're a race that's completely unbound. They acknowledge Karen and the mothership as a peer, and they know of a prophecy that has foretold the exiles' return. So they help you prepare for the path ahead with ion cannon technology and priceless exposition. The Bentusi are a great idea, and they're executed in a really unique way. After tracking down and taking revenge on the fleet that destroyed Karak, you enter a nebula even the Bentusi fear. Nothing returns. There you're greeted by its inhabitants who invite you to join them permanently in the nebula or die. Deeper into the nebula, you discover a ship that is an exact match for the one that the exiles discovered the Guidestone in. After 2 missions of pitched battle, after destroying all their ships and killing most of them, the truth comes out. These nebula dwellers are exiles as well, splintered from the group, who never made it to Karak and instead hid in the nebula from the Taidan. None may leave so that the Taidan never discover them. You've just killed all the family, however distant you're ever likely to connect with again. It is such an incredible balance of melancholy revelation, grand sci-fi world-building, and gorgeous fleet-to-fleet combat. Everything works in a complementary way, building towards a genuinely multifaceted sci-fi experience. It's very traditional sci-fi in many ways, but it's done with confidence and creativity. It feels fresh, even after 15 years, and it'll continue to feel fresh in another 15. The elements of static storytelling are constructed so well that they're almost timeless. Static, expository storytelling isn't the only kind going on, though. The story of your fleet, its specific composition, and its triumphs and defeats are influenced much more by player agency and how a player engages the game tactically in the mechanics than the story itself, although the story provides all the context. It's not only that you have a persistent fleet of your own units. The player's affection for their fleet is significantly increased by the inclusion of the salvage corvette, a small, brilliant unit that, in cooperation with up to 3 other salvage corvettes, can seize an enemy capital ship, bring it back to the mothership, and have it filled with your pilots to fly your colors. It's a little tricky to accomplish a salvage. The AI will target your corvettes, they know what's up with them, so you have to have a successful distraction going on and take ships when they're unescorted or capture them all at once in a clump. Since this is a significant triumph that can grow your fleet out past its supply limit, you remember these ships that you capture. And as the game progresses and they stay with you from mission to mission, they become a living record of your accomplishments as a strategist. When you finally bring ion array frigates you captured in the first few missions into orbit around the homeworld at last, the breadth of your journey is made vividly present. It's much more meaningful than building a new base every time, like most other RTS titles. You develop a real, lasting, personal investment in specific ships in your fleet. When they take heavy damage and begin to cry out in distress, you worry for them. And when they break apart and explode in a bright blue pop, you know you failed them on an equally personal level. Units are so disposable in most RTS games that you never have any sensation of the emotional weight of command. It's a game, and there's a lot of satisfaction in mastering a game, but you don't feel sympathy for pieces on a chessboard. Homeworld inspires that sympathy, and without the salvage mechanic, it wouldn't be nearly as pronounced. Once you get past a certain mission and region of a galaxy, you're through. You never see many of those ship designs again. So they're not as disposable as the units that you can rebuild at will. Plus, the look of them, moving in formation, is, no joke, pretty damn majestic. The understated sound design very much reinforces this emotional investment. All the radio chatter is very conversational, except when things get desperate, and then a nervousness creeps into the dialogue. Not yelling and screaming, but instead trying to maintain their professional composure, but no longer managing to do so quite so well. It's a major part of why sound design is so remarkable in Homeworld. All the dialogue, really, from cutscenes to carrier selection, have an understated sense of emotional authenticity. It contributes significantly to the player investment in the battle. It's not enough to win at all costs. The cost is reflected in the calm, confident voices who follow your every command. There's a significant and important gameplay aspect to emotionally investing in your fleet as well. Without hoarding some resources, without being miserly with your ships, you might not be able to win the last couple of missions. The level of opposition you encounter as you approach Hagara in the heart of the Taidan Empire is appropriately intense. Mistakes can be completely fatal, and if you suffer tremendous losses before you reach Hagara, the Taidani Home Guard will wipe the floor with you. You need a massive, massive counter for what's tossed at you in the last mission. It's a pretty amazing example of tying together the story with the mechanics of the game, and they're tied together on a lot of levels too, in the pacing of the story, in the necessity of careful resource management across every single mission, in the way that the player considers their tactical options before engaging every time it happens. The capability of your fleet is always expanded just enough to tackle the difficulties of the next mission, no more. You're never really overpowered. Unless you capture every last ion cannon frigate in the sphere in Mission 14, but that's almost the end of the game anyway. You'll still need those frigates. Homeworld is a difficult game, and the difficulty curve has always been very steep. The challenge, though, is a meaningful part of player investment in the story, and I'm actually glad that there's no sliding scale difficulty. A satisfying underdog story requires the protagonist to legitimately overcome insurmountable odds through their own conviction and craft. An easy difficulty setting and an easy journey undermines what it means to take this story to its conclusion. This is part of what I mean by the parallel narratives of the static plot and the persistent fleet mechanics. They tell the same story, 2 different ways, at the same time, in perfect harmony. It's what makes Homeworld such a vivid piece of science fiction media in a cross-format way. It draws on decades of traditional science fiction and crafts its presentation in ways that highlight and magnify what's engaging and wonderful about science fiction as a broad genre. Homeworld isn't just a virtual board game about blowing up ships. It's a great science fiction story, and a story that's told uniquely in many ways to each player, whose story unfurls through their own ingenuity as much as the written dialogue. There never was another game quite like Homeworld, not even its sequels. It's a singular achievement in game design. There are others who followed in the true 3D space strategy format, like Nexus and Hegemonia, but they were both much more awkwardly designed in the mechanics department, and never remotely hit the same kind of engaging plot notes that Homeworld did. So it's a genuine cause for celebration that Gearbox spent so much time and effort with Homeworld Remastered, the HD re-release from earlier this year that all of this footage is from. Gearbox has a spotty track record of in-house rehabs of old series, having soured a lot of people's expectations with Duke Nukem Forever and Colonial Marines. Homeworld is different. They had a lot of respect for the source material, and left everything important, intact, and untouched. The cutscenes were jazzed up considerably, but retained the feel of the original ones. It's a successful update. We'll see the original style of cutscenes next when we look at Cataclysm, but I think you'll agree that what happened in the remasters was a positive change. Another positive change is automatically harvesting remaining resources for you once you've completed all your objectives. In the original game, you'd have to wait around for a frustratingly long time after the official end of levels for your harvesters to tap out a map. Remember, the resources available across all missions are finite. You need them all. This change eliminates the only flat spot of the original game's pacing. Really, there's only one change from the 1999 game that the 2015 re-release should have had: sphere formation for your ships. The re-release uses the same engine that Homeworld 2 does, and Homeworld 2 had also eliminated sphere formation. But that's because in that game you have squadrons of strike craft and not individual ones. Sphere is a useful formation for Homeworld 1, and its absence was conspicuous. But if that is the only complaint I can come up with, that is an unfathomably glowing recommendation of the new version. It's wonderful. And it includes versions of the original games on their original engines for free. You don't even have to play the new version if you buy the remaster. You can play the optimized old ones. They've even added a remastered version of a lost or cut level from the first game where you fight a tyrannic carrier fleet above their own homeworld. The only thing they don't have is the middle game in the Homeworld series, the standalone expansion, Homeworld Cataclysm. The people behind the remaster, Gearbox, say that the source code no longer exists and it infamously refuses to run on newer versions of Windows. There's a workaround for that, as it turns out. There's an appendix on this video with instructions on how to get Cataclysm to run on Windows 8. If you do get it to run, you'll find that it's more than an expansion. Homeworld Cataclysm is a full-fledged sequel with a completely unique take on Homeworld's many successes. Cataclysm is remarkable because it uses plot elements that were present in the original game manual's novella to build an incredibly vivid portrait of Hagara after the return of the exiles in ways not explored by the original game. And then it introduces exciting new complications unlike anything seen in the previous title. Cataclysm tells another underdog story, but one that's really novel, exploring the same rhythms of storytelling from the original game without hitting any of the exact same notes. Instead of the mighty mothership, the apex of your civilization's ambitions to escape Karak, you control a lowly mining vessel, the Kunlan. As the lore goes, after the return to the homeworld, the survivors reorganized into their traditional tribal kiths, who compete fiercely with one another for scientific and economic advantages. Kith Somta is one of the more minor kiths, and the Kunlan is about as fancy as it gets for them. They are desperate for an advantage. Meanwhile, the old Taidan Empire is fragmented into the Taidan Republic, friends of the exiles, and the Imperial Remnants, who still control tremendous military might in the outer reaches of their former empire. The first level sees you defending Hagara from an incursion by Imperial remnants, but this battle just serves to underline how dismissive the more powerful kiths, using the warships of the original game, feel towards the Somta. No one respects the mining kith. So within the opening level, you've not only got a satisfactory expansion of lore from the first game's climax, you've had the game completely reframe the focus from the success of the Kushan, as the exiles are more broadly called, to the more specific concerns of the Somta kith. And it's done almost effortlessly. Somta units are industrial designs, repurposed to fill combat roles. They have none of the elegance of the original ship designs. They are deliberately workmanlike and ugly. It's brilliant, especially when you capture fancier ships. The disparity in cultural values between the Somta and the Taidani and even the rest of the Kushan is delightfully evident. What isn't immediately evident is where the plot of Cataclysm might go after the first two missions. The homeworld is secure, the Taidan Empire has waned almost completely, Cataclysm doesn't have a grand prophecy to fulfill. If you're going to tell an underdog story, you need an appropriately difficult obstacle to overcome. The game does deliver, in a way completely unlike the first Homeworld. Instead of Homeworld's elegant but straightforward sci-fi, Cataclysm aims to be the first and only survival horror 3D real-time strategy game, and it scores a phenomenal bullseye. The trouble begins with a beacon of unknown design, as it so often does. What makes it vivid is how competent the setup is. There is an intense amount of political pressure on the Kunlan to make a discovery that will force the Hagaran Council to take the Somta Kith seriously. Somta wants their full slice of the homeworld, so they'll take a little bit of a risk. To really analyze the beacon, the Kunlan rescues a Somta science vessel, the Kleson, from raiders. Then, disaster strikes. A residue in the beacon turns out to not be inert after all. It grows exponentially and consumes the lower decks of the Kunlan in seconds, and everyone aboard the entire lower deck section must be jettisoned to save the rest of the ship. The mission begins with you down half a starship, the lower decks tumbling away in a burst of agonized screams and then equally agonizing silence. When you track down with a Cleason, the lower decks infects the Cleason and its escorts as well, who immediately reverse direction and attack you, quietly, their pilots reduced to a goo that seeps out through the panels of the ships. The graphics are, as I'm sure you've noticed, a pretty big step backwards from the last footage, but in 2000 this was really cutting-edge presentation. There's two things that carry over from Homeworld that allow it to effortlessly include survival horror elements once the plot introduces a monstrous antagonist. The persistent fleet and finite resources across the board, reflecting the limited inventory of more traditional survival horror titles, and the sense of hopeless isolation, made manifest by the emptiness of space. Nothing stands between you and the monster but your fleets. You are constantly in mortal peril, with no chance of receiving help, the same way a survival horror game would connive it, but in a strategic context. It's a genius reframing of well-established gameplay tropes from an entirely different gameplay genre, and it's a reframing that dovetails with the rhythms of storytelling and mechanics of gameplay that were so distinctive to the original Homeworld. The crew of the Kunlun realize that they're the only ones who are in any position to close the Pandora's box they opened with the beacon. They have to have the courage to face the thing they've unleashed, even though they are hopelessly outmatched and unequipped. In a way, Dead Space can be seen as reappropriating for the survival horror genre the horror aesthetic of Cataclysm, MacGyvering tools to use as weapons against a foe that can weave your flesh to its own purposes, with a deep contrast between the hastily engineered, brutally brilliant means of defense and the monster's horrifying, seemingly unstoppable base nature. But here, it's on a fleet-wide instead of an individual scale. Not only does this let Cataclysm qualify as its own underdog story completely distinct from Homeworld, it's one with a reluctant hero trope thrown in on top of it. But just because it's a trope doesn't mean they aren't clever in how they use it. It's a shame that this game gets labeled as an expansion and not a real sequel, because it's just as long as the original Homeworld, if not a little longer. The horror elements slowly ratchet up alongside the Kunlun's capabilities. Critically, the game reinforces its survival horror elements by lowering your supply cap decidedly under the fleet sizes of the original game, and doesn't diversify your fleet with capital ships for an unexpectedly long time. It's a confident pacing decision, though. You're a mining vessel. You're not meant to sustain an entire fleet around you, so you can't until circumstances force you to engineer ways to expand. The Infection is a biomechanical creature called the Beast. It can use both electronic and biological systems to its own ends, using flesh to form its own circuits on top of a ship's existing ones. It came from the in-between areas of hyperspace, when a vessel from outside the galaxy used an immensely powerful hyperspace drive to make the millions upon millions of light-years jump. In that transition, the Beast found them. When they realized what happened, they scuttled the drives, but a distress beacon was launched, with a tiny portion of the Beast writhing inside, lost for 1,000,000 years. Until you find it. It's a great setup, and its horror storytelling is really brilliantly done. A particular standout is defending a civilian refugee colony as the Beast fires swarms of missiles to infect them. Each infected ship will use the flesh of its crew to create new missiles and fire them at nearby ships. If there's a way to save everyone, I haven't found it. It's genuinely disconcerting and very effectively creepy. While the game never has scares, and doesn't operate on a scale that really permits scares, it is unbelievably good at creating moods of dread and apprehension, and in that way, it really succeeds at its horror. When the Beast starts learning to talk and starts imitating ships you once knew, it is spooky as hell. Like the first game, sound design is really outstanding. The voice acting is particularly notable for how good it is. Everybody puts in a really heartfelt performance, and even though there's no big names in the cast, everyone makes the absolute most of their lines. In some cases, they manage to pull off difficult feats of video game storytelling. The best example in the game is one of the last missions, where the Bentusi are fleeing the galaxy and the Kunlun tries to prevent them from leaving. They refuse, and when you destroy their gate, they swear to annihilate you for your interference. This is so out of character for the Bentusi, but it's made clear that they're lashing out from fear, a greater fear than they've felt in millennia. So the crew of the Kunlun lashes out in return with weapons and over-the-communications array, shaming the Bentusi for what they're doing, shaming their fear, shaming their brutality. This is all delivered via canned dialogue, from pixelated ship to pixelated ship, but the voice actor puts enough genuine rage into his delivery of speech, such fantastic bitterness, that it is tremendously effective. I'm far from the only person blown away by the game pulling off this moment. Stu Shearer has a great article on The Escapist about just this level, and you can find a link to it in my video description. In the early levels, the voice acting and the way the Kunlun engages the beast is nervous and tentative, in over their heads and very aware of it. By the time you get to the Bentusi Exodus, you are the only ones who can end the threat before it reaches the homeworld. It's all or nothing, and it is heartbreaking, really heartbreaking, to witness the mission veer so far towards nothing before the Bentusi back down. It's highly effective video game storytelling, and extremely competent science fiction world-building. So why isn't Cataclysm as well regarded as Homeworld if it's so similar in quality? Ultimately, I think it boils down to Cataclysm being a much messier, freewheeling title than the original game. Homeworld the First benefits from extreme focus in its plot, pacing, and delivery, and makes it very clear early on where things will eventually end up, then paints the journey in between as vividly and creatively as possible. Cataclysm is less scrutable, and it has some gameplay tweaks and additions that are fun, but more obviously gamified than the original title, like big purple space crystals that contain tremendous bonus resources, and a new class of vessel called microships. Most ships also have upgrades and bonus abilities, making engagements more chaotic and colorful than before, which is not always the absolute best thing in a game so heavily focused on strategic resource management. Other mechanics, like fighters that link together to form fat corvettes, are much more fun in practice. In terms of ship design, though, it's a little silly. There's a serious elegance to the ships of the original Homeworld, and while the Sumta are different by narrative design, their ships come across as more goofy than industrial, maybe 1 time out of 4? That's 1 time out of 4 more than the original game, though, so it certainly contributes to the game being regarded as not quite as good. Then, of course, there's the fact that it was billed as a standalone expansion and not a full sequel. People at the time just didn't realize how massive and well-designed a game this was, and it didn't do well enough commercially to stay in the spotlight for long enough to correct that impression. Since its source code is MIA, the future of the game is uncertain. For fans of the series, it's pretty categorically a can't-miss title, but since it was only available as a retail product once, 15 years ago, and then never again, the world conspires to make you miss it anyway. You can still track down used copies, but you'll pay a bit, $20 to $30 for a jewel case. It's a collector's item now. But with no digital rights management, those discs will work fine if they come with a unique CD key, and if you use the utility program I talk about at the end of the video. For some reason, and I genuinely don't understand why, not even Relic would support Cataclysm's creative, playful vision for the franchise. Homeworld 2 would make no mention of any of the events in Cataclysm, and its canonicity is frustratingly vague. Homeworld 2 ignores quite a bit about its predecessors, to the point where it feels like a game out of focus, vaguely resembling the game you're looking for, but indistinct and unsatisfying. Homeworld 2 isn't a bad game. It just loses touch with many of the things that made the first 2 titles so uniquely memorable and engaging. Homeworld 2 is an average, ploddingly deliberate hard sci-fi title. The franchise might have been better off if the sequel had been truly terrible. There would have been some kind of outcry about it. Instead, you get a technically accomplished, creatively deficient title that engages neither a player's imagination nor a player's anger. It is maddeningly bland, and it highlights just how much of the first game's success is on account of its writing and how it frames the player's journey. Homeworld 2 takes place nearly 100 years after the first game, when a bandit warlord named Makan invades Hagaran space with a massive navy of marauders called the Vaegir. Within the first 2 levels, Makan has seized Hagara. Your only hope rests with the new mothership, which looks almost exactly like the old mothership, and is also controlled by a Karen Sajet, having transferred from the first mothership. There's a brand new ancient prophecy, one about a trio of powerful and possibly mystical hyperspace cores, one that had traveled with the exiles to Karak, one in the Bentusi harbor ship of Bentus, and one in Makan's massive flagship. Obviously, you've got to collect all 3. These will unlock an ancient ship you can use to reclaim your destiny and take back Hagara. In blurb description, this all sounds pretty cool. In practice, not much more is actually explained than I just relayed to you. Both previous games provided fascinating and concrete answers to questions the players might have about the plot. Homeworld 2 is comfortable in a fog of mystical space opera nonsense. No mention of any kind of Kith politics or Hagaran culture as it might have changed in 100 years is given. The gap in time only means that there have been radical ship redesigns. Since Hagaran space is under total lockdown for 90% of the plot, your missions have you gallivanting around the rural galaxy, fiddling around with ancient prophecy and derelict warships, completely ignoring the plot threads and world-building accomplished by the previous 2 games. This essential disconnection from things the previous games had made you care about is devastating to player investment. Worse, the game even appropriates mission design and plot elements from both previous titles, recycled so blatantly that it feels like déjà vu. The impression it leaves is as vague as deja vu, too. Why should a direct sequel to one of the real masterpieces of game design struggle so much for distinctiveness? The answer begins to surface when delving into some of Homeworld 2's alterations in the game mechanics and structure of classic Homeworld gameplay. Like many game sequels, Homeworld 2 has the idea that bigger is better, that being epic is the primary quality that a game should strive towards. We have talked a little about how that outlook impacted the plot. Its influence in the mechanics is equally disappointing. Instead of individual strikecraft, you build squadrons of 3 to 5 who you can reinforce if they get partially destroyed. It adds to the visual spectacle. You'll generally see more strikecraft in any given engagement than in previous games, but it takes away from the sense of individual unit identity. You don't think of them as pilots and ships anymore. You think of them as a tactical unit on the board. The salvage mechanic is intact, but significantly altered. Instead of using salvage corvettes or workers to swarm an enemy capital ship and drag them away from the engagement, you have marine frigates. These frigates pull up alongside during an encounter and begin a countdown timer. If they can stay hooked to the other ship until the counter runs down, that ship is yours on the spot. Multiple marine frigates make the timer go faster. And it makes more sense in a way. You're literally sending in troops to seize the bridge of the enemy vessel. But it is not as charming, and the slow-moving frigates take up valuable supply points and are easily destroyed. Those enemy ships can still fight while the seizure attempt is being made, both tactically and in terms of visual charm. Having salvage units swarm and haul away an enemy ship was so much more satisfying. Even if workers were destroyed en route to turn in the enemy ship in previous games, the ship was still partially disabled and moved away from the combat. I barely ended up salvaging anything at all in Homeworld 2. I didn't want to sacrifice the frigate supply slots, and I knew that my marine frigates would be destroyed without getting to complete their job. Overall, Homeworld 2 actually discourages the kind of personal, emotional investment in your fleet that the other two games did such a good job of fostering. Frigates have paper-thin armor and have to be rebuilt so constantly that you sometimes go through multiple reproductions of your entire frigate lineup in a single mission towards the end of the game. But there is no bigger culprit in sabotaging a player's personal investment in their fleet than the difficulty system. Cataclysm is the only homeworld with a difficulty slider, and in that game, it can certainly make the game outrageously easy if you slide it in that direction. The higher the difficulty, the greater the satisfaction for both Homeworld and Homeworld Cataclysm. A lot of that, though, was how the difficulty magnified the underdog triumph going on in the plot. Homeworld 2 goes back to having only one default difficulty setting, but it's an adaptive system that skews towards the legitimately unfair more often than not. At the beginning of every mission, the composition of your fleet is analyzed by the AI, and their fleet is constructed on the spot as a direct counter to your ships with a much higher supply limit. You are at a complete disadvantage each and every level, no matter how well you did in the previous mission. In fact, the better you do, the more ships that the enemy will spawn. If you salvage each and everything that you can in a mission, the enemy will still always have enough firepower to destroy your entire fleet. This doesn't become hugely obvious until the last few missions, and then it is crushingly unfair. You can have enough supply for 2 battlecruisers, the heaviest ship you can build. When the enemy sends 5 of their battlecruisers at once at you, you're probably going to have to replay the mission until you figure out how to draw them off one by one somehow, which is not likely. The other option, and I'm not kidding about this, is to retire all or most of your ships at the end of the previous mission, and then build a new force from scratch at the beginning of the level you're trying to beat. This will trip up the AI and cause it to spawn only a manageable amount of units. It is the only way to compensate for the adaptive difficulty in this game. Love of your fleet is one of the fundamental cornerstones of the first game's success. To go from considering the personal battle history of individual frigates to retiring your entire fleet en masse in a desperate attempt to get past a level you're not even that into in the first place illustrates quite vividly how delicate the balance of the first game's design is to be so memorable, how easily that balance is upset by design elements that seem bold at the time but hold up about as well as cardboard in the rain. The negative changes in the mechanics dovetail in a frustrating way with the negative changes in the storytelling. They both seem to think they're making improvements while only serving to distance the game from what's so lovable and distinctive about the first two. When talking about the first game, I talked about how other strategy games do a poor job of expressing the weight of command, of connecting you enough with your forces to feel sympathy for them. That without emotional identification, these are just pieces on a chessboard. I feel like that might actually be a deliberate design decision on Relic's part with Homeworld 2. This game is much more focused on its internal mechanics and its self-identity as a game than on its plot and its self-identity as a science fiction story. The parts of Homeworld 2 that relate solely to its presentation as a real-time strategy game are comparatively quite competent. The remastered versions of Homeworld 1 and 2 both use a jazzed-up version of Homeworld 2's original game engine. 12 years later, it's still an excellent technical foundation to build a game off of. The amount of articulation on the ships themselves, large and small, is quite impressive, and both the Vaegir and Hagaran ships have beautiful designs. In terms of aesthetics, though not internal consistency, I actually prefer the Vaegir over the Tydani. The game tries to set up its plot moments like a kind of greatest hits of Homeworld mission design, intending to create interesting tactical situations where it fails to create compelling characterizations and motivations. For example, the movers function and look almost exactly like the swarmers do in the first game's Nebula missions, even featuring them at about the same point in the story that the first game introduced the swarmers. There's an escort mission where you have to protect cryo trays with fighter escorts, a half-and-half blend of the third mission of the original game and the convoy defense mission in Cataclysm. When you acquire the Dreadnought in Homeworld 2, you can fire its main cannon only once before it overheats and seizes, and you have to deal with it. Exactly what happens to the siege cannon in Cataclysm. And then there is Homeworld 2's use of the Bentusi. The Bentusi simply don't make a lot of sense in this game. It is in the only indirect nod to Cataclysm in the entirety of Homeworld 2. There is one remaining Bentusi ship in the entire galaxy. Their oldest one, the Great Harbor Ship of Bentus. They swing by to drop some vague mystical prophecy nonsense. Unite the three. Hyperspace cores have special powers. And when you see them next, they drop some bizarre backstory about being partially responsible for the exiles being exiled over a conflict regarding the hyperspace core. And so, out of some kind of weird guilt, they blow themselves up to destroy the ancient progenitors, seeker guardians that have been pursuing you since you acquired the Dreadnought. Poof! No more Bentusi. After a few lines of stilted info dumping. So, where Homeworld 2 isn't derivative, it has no real idea how to use the plot elements so lovingly crafted by previous titles. It also features an excessively far-ranging happy ending. When you unite the three cores, you find a deus ex machina that opens up a whole network of hyperspace gates and usher in a new era of cooperation, prosperity, and peace, with Karen Sjet as the immortal Sajuk Kar, benevolently overseeing it all. This all happens in a 90-second cutscene after the last level, which I don't have footage of because I am completely jammed up on the Thotis Sabbat on account of the adaptive difficulty and my dislike of the game. A link to the ending cinematic is available in the video description. But those 90 seconds don't leave the plot with much room to set up a sequel even if they wanted to. It is a happy ending, so wide in scope it's like a fairy tale. The galaxy lives happily ever after. The end. And it sure was the end of Homeworld for over a decade. Studio shutdowns, legal shuffling, and an incredibly lukewarm reception of Homeworld 2 all conspired to keep the series at a constantly receding point of memory in gaming culture. Windows 7 runs the original Homeworlds badly, and Windows 8 struggles to run them at all. So the HD remaster is kind of a big deal for a number of reasons. 1, it puts the series back in the spotlight in an incredibly positive way. 2 is that it demonstrates the commercial demand for a true 3D space RTS. And thirdly, it holds a good and a bad example of Homeworld design right next to each other, their contrasting successes and failures a package deal for players to experience. It shows Homeworld in the best possible light. A brilliant game, made obscure before its time by the rise of console gaming, changing technology, and a disappointing sequel. It shows a potential developer of a new Homeworld game what works and what doesn't, and then user reviews of the remastered version will reflect what series fans might like or dislike about a future title. It's the start of a serious conversation about a Homeworld 3, and the start of a serious conversation about why a game from 1999 could feel so much more cohesive, brilliant, and fresh than many brand new titles. In a contemporary games market that consistently ignores and minimizes the thrill of real-time strategy games, Homeworld makes a powerful statement. There was a time when everyone seemed to be saying that adventure games were permanently done for, but now look at Telltale, the new Dreamfall chapters, and how that subgenre completely turned around. All it takes is creativity and confidence. Homeworld's been vividly demonstrating those traits for 16 years straight, and I'm very excited for what the attention being paid to it could mean for the RTS subgenre as a whole. All in all, there's a lyric in a song that prog rock band Yes did for the original game's credits that I feel sums up what Homeworld means to gaming at large. The history of the future was surely made. Thanks for watching. So now on to the subject of how to get Cataclysm to run on Windows 8. The main challenge is that only one compatibility mode works for Cataclysm, Windows NT compatibility, and Windows 8 does not offer Windows NT as a compatibility option. However, there is a utility, an official Microsoft utility called a Compatibility Toolkit. Install Cataclysm from disk and update it, and then install the toolkit. Links for both are provided in the video description. The disk you'll need yourself. Then, start a new compatibility database with new, then select Fix and direct it to the cataclysm.exe. Click Next, select Windows NT from the compatibility options, and also check off all the Run as Admin permissions boxes. Then click straight on through the next two screens. Then, select Run while the toolkit is still open. This is important. If you don't launch Cataclysm from within the compatibility toolkit, you'll see no results from what you do. You might even have to hit Run twice. I often do for some reason, but it launches the second time quite reliably. Then you'll want to switch from rendering with Direct3D to OpenGL from within the options menu of Cataclysm. You can force higher resolutions by editing the config file, but so long as you're able to use OpenGL, you should experience no significant problems. If you are only able to use Direct3D, you are not in Windows NT compatibility mode. Enjoy this important piece of gaming history.
This video, this channel, and pretty much everything you see from me is currently crowdfunded by a website called Patreon, where viewers like you can contribute to help me make these sorts of videos. I'd like to take the time to thank by name the people who are currently donating at the $10 or more, a month or more level. These people would include Cassie Bayer, Christian Zachariansen, Soeb Sheik, Hat Hay, Yuri Petness, White Zero, Espen Steinsnes, Irvin, William Kreusch, Joshua Hartnett, Oliver Handliken, Joe Wolf, Kimmo Heikkinen, Stefan Persson, Richard Stevenson, Jonas Neefs, Hakan Sayalealu, Jonas Rock, Stephen Lark, Preston Allen, Daniel Zooks, Signe Jensen, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Nobody, Jonathan Fleichener, Sil Sangusta, Ryan Gunst, Brad Wallace, Connor Biblo, Kumarin Vajan, Chocolate Cake, Anax of Rhodes, Niels Bachfrommer, Spyro Sideris, Kevin DeBolt, Rob Clark, Matthew Lagden, Harley McAvoy, Valentin Selesnyov, Jared Liebmiller, Michael Gillis, Brandon, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Richard Williams, Jack Pointa, Tizer Vicarian, Julian Yoon, Dan Reeder, Jared Meyer, Justin Hughes, Aidan Kennedy, Florence Sabot, Chris, Josh Sparks, Ivan Marinoff, Jake Brennan, Brad Carr, Colin, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Andreas Larson, Finn Spencer, Adam Shelley, Devin Knoll, Martin Scanning, Brett Giano, Galak, Chris Rosildo, Andrew Foltz, Martin Karsten, Seth Downing, and Pavel Maximov. Thanks again for watching.
They all behave in ways that look gorgeously realistic, if not on account of the graphics, then on account of their rhythms and movements. It's ballistic ballet in space. A hell of a hook. That's the thing about combat in Homeworld. Every tactical situation has a story-driven context and deeply immersive elements, but it is visually thrilling and complex, even and perhaps especially when the stakes are highest and the situation is desperate. When the mothership returns to Karak is on fire. The entire planet, everyone who ever helped build the mothership and dreamt of what Hogara might look like, is dead. All that's left is 6 trays of 100,000 colonists, under fire from warships of unknown design. When you capture one of the warships, the truth comes out. You are all indeed from Hogara. You were exiled thousands of years ago and forbidden from using hyperspace technology that was reverse-engineered into the mothership. When you jumped to the edge of the system, this fleet committed the genocide of your people to enforce this ancient treaty. The Taidan, as they're called, sit comfortably with Hogara as the seat of their vast and corrupt empire. There's no going back for the people from Karak. Karak is a husk. The only choice the exiles have now is to move deeper and deeper into a galaxy that is as novel as it is hostile. At its heart, Homeworld is a very traditional underdog story, but the beats that the story hits, the richness and understated beauty of its presentation, that's all very unique. It's easy to say, a story about a fleet of dwindling survivors backed by a vaguely Middle Eastern-influenced soundtrack? That's not original. I watched Battlestar Galactica. Well, the reboot of BSG debuted in 2000, widely considered to be one of the greatest strategy titles ever made, and one of the most lasting contributions of gaming to the broader legacy of science fiction in general. The leap from experimental RTS to beloved classic is wholly on account of the game's storytelling and the way the game lets the player experience the scope of the story on a deeply personal level, even within the mechanics. The story is genuinely fantastic itself, easily worthy of being a novel. When the game shipped, it even came with a novella of sorts to back it up. The Homeworld Manual is notable for being this thick, beautifully designed volume that contains a 40-plus page history of Karak, the desert planet where the game opens. It tells the tribe slowly radiating out into the habitable zones of the planet, developing an intricate tribal culture with individual tribes called kiths, and how an ancient discovery would unite them all. The Guidestone, buried in a starship older than all the tribes, contains a star map whose destination is common in every kith's language. Higara, home. No tribe is native to Karak. So over 80 years and countless lives and resources are poured into building the mothership. And this is where the game opens, the triumphant conclusion of an entire planet's decades-long hopes and efforts. It is a new era of possibility, backed by a choral arrangement of Adagio for strings. You're watching footage right now of the remastered version of Homeworld, and we'll talk about the remastering process a little later. For now, it's very important to note that back in '99, this was one of the classiest openings ever put in a game. The remastered version of Homeworld changes no dialogue or cutscenes, besides updating the textures and overall sharpness of the graphical assets. What you see is what people in '99 saw in terms of content. It was jaw-dropping then. Science fiction has always been a cornerstone of game design since the very beginning, but this was something new and bold and entirely beautiful. I remember buying the game when it first came out, one of the most expensive purchases of my middle school life at that point. I couldn't believe they wanted you to have a separate 8-megabyte graphics card for it. Did they think I was made of money? Was it worth upgrading an entire computer to play this game? It was. This game has been lodged in my imagination for 16 years, and I'm hardly alone in that. Homeworld's hook is so good because they start you off with the optimistic flavor of Golden Age sci-fi in the very first level, preparing for a galaxy of adventure. All you need to do is test the hyperdrive and meet the Carsalem, a support vessel which had traveled for years to the edge of the system on conventional drives to meet you. It isn't responding to hails, so you send a probe to investigate. It's a nice, slow build-up, full of tension and a bleeding out of the first level's optimism. Then this.
We're going to be talking about the games in terms of their story and in terms of their gameplay and also in terms of their impact on gaming at large. And at the end, I'm going to tell you how to install Cataclysm on Windows 8. That sounds like a good deal to you. Let's get started.
There's a balance that every science fiction story has to strike between its technology and its emotional storytelling. Each author will value these things differently. Truly talented authors bridge between the two constantly, underlining technical complexities with characters who shoulder the consequences of that complexity, or broadening the depth of relationships between characters with imaginative complications in the world building. Homeworld, on paper, sounds as if it would be a straightforward, hard sci-fi tale of fleets and the destiny of worlds, on the technical side of the equation. As a game, it would have a particular emphasis on the technical and structural elements of the story, and 3D fleet-to-fleet combat on a truly enormous tactical scale hadn't been attempted yet when the game came out in 1999. It would have been a good sci-fi title, innovative, well-positioned in gaming history to stand out. But people don't see Homeworld that simply. It's why... This is just the first of many moments of loss and regret that occur throughout the campaign. The second mission has a perfect rhythm to it. After the tense opener, you have to weather an assault from the mysterious strike craft, and the dogfights are visually spectacular. When we talk about the next game, Cataclysm, you'll have a chance to see the original game engine in action, but whichever game engine you have the game running on, the exhaust trails of fighter craft as they dip, weave, fight, and die is mesmerizing. Genuinely. A good sci-fi author can describe a great battle, a good sci-fi show can show you a great battle, only a game can generate one on demand from scratch. Only Homeworld does it in such an understated and aesthetically intricate way. There's a sense of momentum and agency to all the units, from the largest to the smallest.